Dr. Ellings was assistant director and on the faculty of the Jackson School from 1986 to 1989. My research time shows through. In this capacity, he was a member of the school's executive committee and responsible for a wide range of administrative functions. He taught courses dealing with Asia, American foreign policy, and international relations, including foreign economic policy and international political economy, and was director of the George E. Taylor Foreign Affairs Institute. In 1984 and 85, Dr. Ellings served as legislative assistant in the United States Senate, Office of Senator Slade Gorton. He was the senator's senior advisor for and responsible for legislation on foreign and defense policy issues. Dr. Ellings publishes articles and chapters regularly, and he has a very, very long list of books that I'm not going to share right now. He is the co-founder and co-chairman of the editorial board of Asia Policy, 2006 to present, and founding editor of the NBR Analysis publication series. He established the Strategic Asia Program and Access Asia, the national clearinghouse that tracks specialists and their research on Asia, and has served as consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Department of State, and other U.S. government offices and agencies. He received the University of Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award and was a nominee for the same award at California Polytechnic State University San Luis Obispo, where he taught in 1980 and 81. He specializes in the political economy of international relations and national security, with emphasis on East Asia. Dr. Ellings earned his BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Washington. He studied in China as well, and some of that in the early 1980s when it was really, really interesting. And his professional activities continue to take him overseas regularly. And so we are really delighted that today, for this hour, he is here with us in Pullman, Washington, sharing his insights on Xi Jinping, China's president, reformer, emperor, or authoritarian nationalist, is the question he will address. Please join me in giving Dr. Ellings a warm Cougar welcome.
The nicest thing that's ever been said to me, you just said, Lydia, was that I was alive. You know, I'm a live speaker. That's great. I was kind of impressed at how alive Super K, Henry Kissinger, is. He's 93, and I just pray I have as much hair as he does when I'm 93. That's an amazing amount of hair. Actually, it's something to comb in the morning. One other thing, Lydia, you mentioned, and this is something I'm always pointing out. You know, you go and you have to say when you were born or something. I always like to point out this is 19, not 18. You know, this is an important distinction. Okay, well, I'm gonna start by referring to something that Steve Orland's mentioned, which was a dinner in Seattle 13 months ago when Xi Jinping landed on his way for meetings in Washington, D.C. and New York. And the one meeting he had where he engaged the public, it was totally private. This is not a public meeting, but there were 800 people there, was in Seattle. And I attended that. It was fascinating on a whole bunch of levels because I had an opportunity to sit for an hour and a half, 15 feet from this interesting leader, Xi Jinping. He sat, I'd say, rather regally. It was carefully scripted. He didn't say a word until he spoke at the podium. He sat at a long table. Imagine the head table was probably 80 feet long. And so there were dignitaries at it, and he was dead center. Next to him was his primary host. By the way, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations was one of the two host organizations. The other was the U.S.-China Business Council. The chairman of the U.S. Business Council then, that year, was Mark Fields, CEO, chairman of the Ford Motor Company, who sat right next to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping never acknowledged him, never spoke to him, never looked at him. There were jillions of cameras. The security personnel and the media from China overwhelmed everything else. The tables were populated, besides with media and security people, with business people. I'd say 50% of the room was filled with Chinese. And so, in any case, it went on. Xi Jinping sat there, and speaker after speaker went to the podium. Xi Jinping was officially welcomed by Commerce Secretary Pritzker, who spoke on behalf of President Obama and said so. He never acknowledged her, never turned around. He had his back to the podium, right? Facing the audience, facing the cameras, brilliant spotlights on him. Gary Locke, the recent ambassador to China, spoke, and he didn't acknowledge him. Governor Inslee spoke. The mayor of Seattle spoke. Not once did Xi Jinping turn around until Henry Kissinger strode to the podium. And here, of course, is at that time 92-year-old, at the behest of Nixon, opened up China. And Kissinger did acknowledge at one point, but it was really Nixon's idea that this breakthrough take place. In any case, Kissinger strode to the podium at 92 years of age. And because of his role in U.S.-China relations, from 69, when he took over as National Security Advisor, particularly from 1971 to the present, he has stayed in contact, as he said, with Chinese leaders until then. In any case, out of respect for that long friendship, that close relationship between Chinese leaders and Kissinger, and age, Xi Jinping turned halfway around and turned his neck the other halfway around and listened to Kissinger speak. And Kissinger introduced him. The dinner ended with Xi Jinping speaking himself, carefully scripted. Winston Lord, a former U.S. ambassador to China, characterized the speech as basically full of newspeak. If you're a fan of George Orwell in 1984, you know what that means. But terms that really don't mean quite what they mean, and there was no content, but it didn't matter. It was diplomatic, and at the end, you had 800 people giving him a standing ovation. Well, okay, that's kind of sets the kind of tone for this. So I'm going to try to do two things really quickly. Why in the world do we care that much about Xi Jinping? Why should we know about him? Why should we care? And then secondly, once we do know something, some reason for knowing about him, what is it in particular? What is he like? And what is it we can learn about perhaps the future of China and U.S.-China relations and maybe world relations more broadly from knowing about him? So that's what I'm going to do really quickly, and I'm hoping to do so. This is going to be rapid fire, and I apologize. There's going to be a lot of information in a short period of time. So going ahead of and anticipating a little more than what was said in Kissinger's remarks, today China, depending on how you measure its economy, is number one or number two in the world. If it's measured in nominal terms, according to current exchange rates, it's number two. But even in nominal terms, with current exchange rates, its industrial sector is 1.5 times the size of America's, which is a huge change in world affairs. Since the late 19th century, America's industrial sector has led the world. That is no longer the case. According to another type of measurement of economies, PPP, the size of China's economy is already bigger than that of the United States. So when he talks about 2050 or 20 whatever, essentially you should understand that really now China has a sense that its economy is an enormous factor and in many ways more capable than that of the United States. In some ways not as capable. It's not as innovative and so on, but in many measures as or more capable. Secondly, China's role in world trade is more than the United States. Of course, we've always, for so many years, been the world's largest trading nation. We're not anymore. China's turnover in trade in goods exceeded that of the United States starting in 2012. In addition, China, as you undoubtedly know, has embarked on an enormous military buildup and modernization program, taking what was a Soviet-style, bureaucratic, ineffective land army and transforming it into the world's second most powerful military. Whether it's land forces, air, naval forces, cyber, space, and so on, it's an extraordinary accomplishment that China continues to work on at a very rapid pace. And interestingly, in naval and projection forces, so what had been a traditional land power is now thinking in more blue water navy and global terms. In addition, China has embarked on a lot of initiatives, diplomatic and economic, that suggest high ambition. Kissinger referred briefly to an effort, an initiative involving Central Asia. He was probably talking about two. One is the One Belt, One Road initiative, in which China is looking at investing. This is not a bank operation, but actually investing in projects of infrastructure that go out through Central Asia and link China to Central Asia, pipelines, roads, railroads, and so on. And also those kinds of links, railroads especially, that would extend down through the Malay Peninsula, down through Indochina, especially through Cambodia and Laos. So that's kind of the One Road. Interestingly, the One Road really refers to maritime initiatives, and the One Belt more through Central Asia toward Europe. At the same time, it has the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which now has 57 countries signed up. I think this is kind of a very interesting initiative by China. It's sort of an alternative to the World Bank. The idea would be that this would focus on Asia and utilize the monies from all over the place, not just in China, to invest in areas that China cares about. So it's, and then of course, often I would expect and hope that to the benefit of neighbors of China. Interestingly, they've taken a very international approach, and if you look at the staff, the makeup, and everything of the AIIB, which is headquartered in Beijing, it has former World Bank people, former ADB people, a Chinese as president, but all kinds of other folks in it. It's fascinating and suggests to me another initiative which should tell us something about China's ambitions, global leadership ambitions. One of the points that China makes clear over and over again is not only is it interested in institutions that it calls 21st century institutions, as opposed to the World Bank and ADB and so on, which it characterizes as 20th century institutions. So of these 21st century institutions, one that it's really concerned about is those institutions that are monetary, like the IMF. It talks about less reliance and actually substituting for the US dollar as the global currency. So it's seeking in various ways to find alternatives in international exchange to the dollar. So to add to what you just heard from Henry Kissinger, we really have, in essence, the rise of a continental-sized power, unlike any rise of any continental-sized power since the United States itself. And of course, it has a population that's 4 times the size of the population of the United States. And so the potential there is obviously tremendous. Well, this is an extraordinary event in world affairs. And obviously, the leader of that country you'd want to know about. particularly, and let me add one other element to this. There are probably lots of students of history here, and even if you're not, you've been reading probably in newspapers, the New Yorker, who knows where, efforts by journalists and academics to try to understand and put in perspective the rise of China in view of the history of the rise of great powers. It's not a pretty history. So if you go back to this and read the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is the first tremendous history written, you learn about the rise of Athens and the threat that that rise posed to Sparta. If you think of the two, it's really interesting. You think of Athens, Athens invented invented philosophy. It invented modern mathematics. It invented extraordinary, innovative culture for its time. Sparta was known for generals and fighting. Athens too, but Athens, if you ever have the time, I would say read the short version, the Cliff Notes to Thucydides. It's a tough slog. I've read the whole thing, but in any case, what happens there is that Athens decides to extend its power to include a town called Megara, and that's one step too far for Sparta. Sparta wins that war. So the more, you'd say, primitive, less innovative society actually wins. Well, the reason I mention this is that the history of rising powers, the history of it almost always results in major war. You think of the 20th century, the industrialization and rise of Japan, the industrialization and rise of Germany. The industrialization and rise of America was noted for some nationalism, but we were taught a lesson early on by Britain not to mess around. If you recall, one of the first things we did was go to war with Britain after we were founded and had our capital burned to the ground. That was humbling. And we had our own horrible war in the Civil War. So while nationalism was high and we had a spat with Spain, Spain was not a major power at the time. It didn't result in world war. That's an exception. Another exception was the rise of Russia and the Soviet Union, which, with its industrialization, highly nationalistic and also driven by a global ideology, a global conquering ideology, nonetheless was parried by the United States and its allies in an extraordinarily successful strategy. In any case, there are exceptions to rises of great powers, exceptions to the incidence of major war. But in most cases, war results. It's just a sobering thought, and so placing into context what Kissinger and Steve Orland's were talking about, understand that the percentage likelihood is that war would result as a consequence of the rise of China and the resulting competition between the extant power and the status quo power, the United States. All right, let me talk about Xi Jinping. So we need to know about Xi Jinping. What's he all about? Are these prior eras, like the extreme nationalism of Germany and Japan associated with their industrialization, are those actually maybe indications of what China is like today? And were the leaders of Germany and Japan like Xi Jinping? Well, Xi Jinping is fascinating on a whole host of measures. I suggested in my opening remarks, how successful he embodies the appearance and bearing of a traditional Chinese leader. He sat there, didn't say a word. He exuded confidence. He exuded strength in that room, and there was no question that he was special in that room of 800 people. There was nobody comparable. He didn't feel necessary to speak one syllable to anybody. He has an interesting bearing. He has an interesting background. He's what they call a princeling. Princelings within China are considered anybody who's an offspring of anybody who's important. But in the China field, and among us China watchers, a princeling has a very specific meaning because it relates to their ability, to some extent, to become a true leader in the country. So he's a princeling in that his father was a senior leader, going back early on with Mao and so on. It wasn't, for any of that generation, a smooth experience with the Cultural Revolution and all that, but his father was a senior leader. And so she went to a very exclusive school, just for the children of senior leaders. The most exclusive school in the country. He got to know them. He got to learn, in a sense, became part of the new royalty of China. And I commend you to read, if you're really interested in this stuff, a new book by Chung Lee, who is at Brookings, and it's on Xi Jinping and the current political system. It's a new book. It's absolutely terrific. The only downside is it's about that thick. And you will read more Chinese names than you've ever seen in your life. So, in any case, Xi Jinping has a fascinating upbringing. Just to boil it down to a few things, he creates great relationships and loyal relationships throughout his life. He also begins to have policy preferences. And these policy preferences include at least some economic reform, but as best we can tell, economic reform within the country that benefits Chinese enterprises. He believes also in a strong socialist component of the economy, so strengthening, not weakening, state-owned enterprises, but favoring all these domestic enterprises over foreign companies. So in some contrast to what you heard, most international companies now are very concerned about their futures in China and have begun to diversify their investments down in China. There's a lot of concern about the direction, failure of economic reform. Secondly, in the political realm, Xi Jinping is absolutely against any political reform. Zero. No democratic Western-style political reform. Zero. In fact, if anything, strengthen the Communist Party, purge those or as many as you can who are corrupt. Of course, the whole system, by the way, is corrupt, so that's impossible. But you can get rid of the worst characters, strengthen this Communist Party, and strengthen its role in Chinese society and in its leadership role. Soon after being chosen as leader and obtaining that office, and by the way, since Deng Xiaoping, the leaders have gone in 2 5-year terms. They get 10 years, 2 5-year terms. According to that schedule, he's chosen, and then he takes office a few years ago. His first term is up next year. So in any case, the first thing he did was launch, and you heard again a reference to it, this anti-corruption campaign. Well, since just about every official in China is probably corrupt to some extent, he has free rein on choosing who the heck he's going after. 100,000 officials have been prosecuted and all found guilty. That's something in the system. If you are accused and you are brought before court, you are guilty. Whether you are or not, but you are guilty. So all of them are guilty. 160 of them were top-ranking officials, really top-ranking, including a couple members who had been members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. That's 7 people. There are 7 people who ultimately rule China, headed by the chairman of the party, Xi Jinping. There are 7 of them. 6 of the 7 right now are close allies of Xi Jinping. So in any case, 160 top officials are purged. 100,000 are prosecuted. It continues. Huge crackdown on dissidents, civil society members, lawyers, and there's been a complete clampdown politically. The internet has been much more sharply restricted. So you have, in fact, if you were saying, well, has there been any political reform, enormous step backwards in terms of political reform. He's been very clear on this. Now, I want you to think just for a second, if you are an autocrat, you're in an autocratic system, what are the bases of your legitimacy? Well, for the last few decades, the bases of legitimacy for Chinese leaders have included tremendous economic growth, 500 or more million people coming out of poverty. Imagine that. This is the greatest alleviation of poverty due to market reforms in the history of humankind. The fastest elevation out of poverty of any group of human beings in history, because they were given the opportunity to own things, invest in something, and make money on it. So that was a basis of legitimacy. And then, of course, because they're not elected, there's no basis there, there's, in addition, embodying the Chinese nation, national aspirations. And finally, in the Chinese context, the sheer ability to wield power is respected. So if you can suppress riots, if you can maintain order, that also is an indication to the people that you are a legitimate ruler. The economy has slowed down. It's slowed down from 10% and 11% growth rates to 6-point-something%, and it may be lower. You can't always trust anybody's statistics. It's hard to know, but clearly the economy is slowing down. It's not expected to recover to those amazing highs that existed for 30 years, 35 years. So decreasingly, economic growth and economic success is a pillar of legitimacy. So if you imagine again, okay, why am I a legitimate ruler? That narrows it a bit. You've got to reduce economic expectations, and you have to embody more and more the nation. Hence the China dream. Xi Jinping's basic slogan and claim to legitimacy is the China dream. The return of China to its greatness. Greatness in wealth, greatness in power, greatness in essence as the central kingdom. All these, think about again, the One Belt, One Road, the AIIB, the greatness of China in terms of military power. And so Xi Jinping has become more clearly a nationalist leader of China than any prior leader in the modern era. Since '49. Every leader has been highly nationalistic, but there were other bases of power for Mao, ideology, the revolution, personal charisma. Xi Jinping, by the way, is trying to develop that personal charisma himself. And so that's another element which is fascinating to watch. So we have, as China rises and slows its economic growth, a powerful national leader, more powerful than any individual leader of China since at least Deng Xiaoping and maybe Mao. And that's what we've got. I would argue that if whoever comes in, and it's going to be undoubtedly, it looks like, if the polls are correct, it's going to be Hillary Clinton as president, that, as somebody indicated here, as Kissinger did, you're going to need some great advice on China, because China is the most powerful nation in the Eurasian continent, and in some ways developing power greater than that of the United States. If so, we better be pretty smart. And if history tells us anything, when great rising powers rise to this extent, war happens. And when they're autocratic, it happens even more often, because their basis of legitimacy is narrow, and they really have to embody nationalism first and foremost. Again, historians and others are looking to the 30s, 1930s, and other eras for analogies. So we know this is a huge issue. We know we have to understand Xi Jinping, and we have to understand China. So let me just sum up here. I've given some thoughts, and I will sum up in three things. Number one is, back to the title of this talk, is Xi Jinping a reformer? No, he's not a reformer. Around the edges, maybe an economic reform, absolutely not a political reformer. Second, is he an emperor? Well, he can't pass down his own power to his daughter. He's not going to pass it down. I mean, there is a communist precedent for this, and it's in North Korea. The Kims, it's a dynasty. He's not going to create a dynasty. But he is, if we are reading indications correctly, he is thinking of perhaps not just creating and selecting the next leader. He may be positioning himself to retain power beyond the 10 years, which has been the tradition since Deng Xiaoping, perhaps, and maybe perhaps playing a role more like Deng, where he actually pulls the strings behind the scenes and so retains ultimate power. So one of the things we have to watch, this is again under this kind of emperor rubric, how serious a leader is he? Is he going to pull a Putin, in other words? Is he going to stay in charge even after the 10 years? That's a possibility. We have to watch it very, very carefully. Finally, is he an authoritarian nationalist? Yes. That's what he's all about. That's what he's all about. He is seeking to embody the Chinese nation and the Chinese people's ambitions. And I'd say he's done an amazing job in view of the fact that we never considered him before he had this job at all a charismatic leader. But he's played the role to the hilt. So there you go. And I'm happy to entertain questions. I hope you've got a lot of them. There couldn't be a more important topic than the rise of China and the character of its leadership. Yes?
You need to come to the microphone. You need to come down to the microphone, okay?
Yeah, I'd throw it at you, but you...
Well, so if he did stay past the 10 years, what would that mean? What would that look like?
Well, there are these 5-year terms, and so next year, Xi Jinping is scheduled next year to name his successor. And there's a Central Committee meeting this month, and there is a big party congress next year. Now remember, you have to think of the Chinese context. It's the Communist Party that's determining all these things. So that's who's doing it. There are fewer than 400 members of the Central Committee. The Politburo has 25, and the Standing Committee of the Politburo has 7. So he will name or not name that individual. And we're trying to understand, this is always trying to look inside the black box when decisions like this are made in secrecy by essentially 7 people negotiating among themselves and their friends and their allies and their, different factions. It's an unknown. But it looks like there is some postponing going on. And so that might mean that she is contemplating either trying to solidify supporters so he can name somebody confidently later, or looking to retain power over the longer term. No. No. No, it's not possible, and there is no comparable situation developing like in North Korea. It's not happened. Okay. Next question.
What is Xi Jinping?
You ought to give your name and maybe your major or something about yourself.
I'm Mitchell. I'm a double major in communication and political science. I was wondering what Xi Jinping's, what the public in China's opinion is on him. Do they like him?
He's extremely popular. In fact, this is one of the things, if you're in a communist country, and a guy on the streets asks, what do you think of the leader? You're probably going to say, I think the leader's great. But in fact, as far as we can tell, as high as 80% approval rate. And I can tell you, I have friends, Chinese friends, who have been living in this country, or they're in Singapore, or so on. They're thrilled by him because of his strength and a lot of reasons. They're thrilled by his wife, who was this absolute singing star. She was this huge star. He's kind of a boring-looking guy, but he married this, she's just incredible voice, was famous. She was way better known than he was. In any case, anyway.
Hello, my name is Henry Wheaton. I'm a mechanical engineer, so a little off topic, but this isn't specifically about Xi Jinping, but a little bit more about the Chinese economy as a whole.
Sure.
From a Western perspective, China puts little emphasis on the violation of intellectual property protections, such as copyright infringement.
Correct.
What are the pros and cons of this from an economic standpoint?
Sure. I completely disagree with Steve Orland's. It's a gigantic problem that's not gone away, and it's part of the Chinese strategy and part of their industrial policy in 5-year plans, year after year. Acquisition and then development of technologies, their number one priority in all kinds of major fields, from biochemistry, you name the field, smart cars and solar technology and wind tech, anything cutting edge that would be important to the development of a nation. It is their goal to acquire technology by however means they can get it. And about 3 years ago, we put together a national commission headed by then recent Ambassador to China, John Huntsman, on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, retired Admiral and former Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair. On that commission, we had the recent chairman and CEO of Intel. We had a former senator who had been on the 9/11 Commission. We had, a variety of terrific Americans to look at this issue of the theft of American intellectual property. They looked at the issue as a whole, tremendous amount of research, interviews, and so on. The conclusion was, and this is 3 years ago, that about 70 to 80%, in some cases as low as 50, but usually 70 to 80% of IP theft globally was done by China. And so you think about the Chinese economy as being somewhere between 14 and 18% of the world economy. But they were accounting for 50 to 80%, and usually 80% of IP theft. The IP theft had been industrial policy in China from the very get-go. And so by 1979, it was very focused initially on nuclear questions, missiles, a lot of national security kinds of technologies. By 1979, we were able to document, and Congress had done a lot of investigating on this earlier, that the Chinese had already gotten from our national labs. We invited Chinese specialists into our national labs who were enthusiastic to be engaging China. National labs, all kinds of means. They already had acquired miniaturization technologies for nuclear weapons, as well as the technology to build a neutron bomb, which we never did, by 1979. So it's part of industrial policy in China to acquire, as I said, the highest technology. Here's a great example of what goes on. Not only is it cyber attacks, it's all by all industrial means. So industrial espionage means employees, graduate students in universities, and it's all kinds of folks in all kinds of ways. A friend of mine, a executive out of Washington, D.C. in one of the trade associations there, was in Beijing a couple of years ago, and the Chinese in this one office were proud to show her on this giant board all American National Science Foundation grants. Imagine a giant wall filled with every National Science Foundation grant for every imaginable biotech, physics, you name it. And they were proud to be tracking what professor got that and how they were tracking it. Well, tracking, what did that mean exactly? So it's an all-out effort by all means to acquire technology, and we have to understand that. That has to be our policy. We just have to get it. You ask any American company that, even if they just make tractors, what their knowledge is of, at this point, of how their stuff has been ripped off, it's remarkable. Most companies, though, will not go public for two reasons. One, their stock price will take a hit because they've admitted their stuff's been stolen and that they can't do anything about it. They also don't want to say anything because they're trying to do business in China, and they'll make even more of an enemy out of the Chinese state if they do. So they're intimidated from saying things. So one of the real issues we had on this commission was interviewing American companies and getting the truth out of them. And they would tell us the truth so long as we promised we wouldn't tell anybody. So we have all these anecdotes, unbelievable numbers of anecdotes. And by the way, this was a frustration to the current president, and I assume presidents before, because a company would be complaining bitterly to the president that, hey, if you're going to talk to Xi Jinping or whatever leader before, you've got to raise this incredible issue with they stole our stuff and this all happened. And then the president says, okay, and then the company gets cold feet. Well, we might be able to work this out with China. We've still, we've got $1 billion in sales there, and we don't want to jeopardize that. So I'm not privy to tell you, I can't tell you an enormous number of anecdotes, but a bunch of them are in the press. And so occasionally a company has had it, or it's a smaller company whose business has been destroyed. They've got nothing to lose, and so they'll tell the truth. But it affects universities. Frankly, every university in the country that's doing any cutting-edge research in engineering, physics, and you name it, is vulnerable. And we just have to realize it. Here, there, it's not just in China. Companies today, Steve Orleans doesn't want to say it, but if you represent a major foreign company and you go into China, you don't take your computer, you take a blank computer. Nothing on it. And you leave it before you come home. So I'm just telling you the unvarnished truth here. It's tough. It's really, really tough. Now, in part, this is government directed. In part, it's allowed, just go, it's a free-for-all. So this isn't this isn't just purely bureaucrats in Beijing saying, do this, do that. It's also saying to their entrepreneurs and so on, go for it. So it's both the kinds of, you've heard about the PLA unit that hacked this and hacked that. Sure, there's that. And that unit now is dispersed. It's no longer in that building in Shanghai, but there are others elsewhere. So it's an enormous problem. It is an absolutely enormous problem. And the main effect, of course, on companies and on foreign countries is that it reduces incentive to innovate. If your stuff's going to get stolen, why do I continue to innovate? Why do I continue to invest? Because I'll spend all the money on investing and the stuff is just stolen. So it's a big issue that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching. I actually served as director of the staff of that project and had to live and breathe it. It was more of an eye-opener. I knew it was going to be bad. I did not know how bad. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Eric Gata. I'm a senior and I'm majoring in finance. I actually studied abroad in Chengdu, China.
Oh, you
this
did?
last semester, yeah.
Chengdu.
It was great. Really good food. He's right. Kissinger was right about that.
Now, Chengdu is, aerospace. It's down there in southwestern China. And on the other hand, what did you learn that China's #1, and that what did you learn about America when you were there?
What I learned about America?
Yeah, what did they say about America?
Well, one of the my question, kind of one thing we talked about a lot with it, we were there, is individualism versus collectivism.
Oh,
And I was just curious on your insight there. Do you think we kind of experienced and saw that China was becoming a lot more individualistic? Do you think that will affect their economy, and do you think the government is going to try and stop that movement, or do you think they'll try and keep it collective?
Okay, well, that's the kind of $64,000 question about China, right? $64 billion, trillion question. China is capable of democratizing, as proven by Taiwan. Taiwan has an incredibly vibrant democracy. Amazing. But I will have to say that the Communist Party has a pretty firm grip. While education levels and so on have gone up so much, and the bases for example, especially for demanding rule of law. I should point, this is really important to point out. The #1 issue for most Chinese, and why there's a flood, one of the reasons there's a flood of money to the United States and other parts of the West from China, is rule of law. Rule of law is huge. And there's no way under the Communist Party there will ever be rule of law, because that means they can't pull the trigger. You can't have an independent judiciary and a single party dictatorship, right? So rule of law is gigantic. And all those Chinese have worked so hard, those 500, 600 million who've come out of poverty. They own something. And they know that even though they own it, in a court of law, if a party person comes in and rips it off, or whatever takes place, the big shots come in, pay you 5 cents on the dollar, and next thing you know, you're on the street. They don't have rule of law. They have rule by law, but they don't have real rule of law. And that is spreading throughout the country. The Chinese understand it. And that is, to me, gives me the greatest hope for change. But that butts in right against the Communist Party. And so on the one hand, you've got this huge demand for rule of law, but on the other hand, they just think Xi Jinping's the greatest thing. So it's complicated. And, but I got to tell you, rule of law is really the issue. Really, really the issue. Now, with regard to collectivism or individualism and so on, we can argue endlessly about, who gets along better. Do Chinese get along better with Chinese than Americans get along with better with? I don't want to even begin to judge that. But I can tell you that rule of law is palpable. And for any of you who know your parents, think about your grandparents coming out of the Depression, working hard, you own your own home, you can defend it in a court, in an impartial court. And in China, you can never depend on that the court will be impartial. Yes?
Hi, I'm Chase. My major is still undecided, but I'm thinking of either Asian studies or foreign language. My question is, to a fault, I would say that the cornerstone of American politics is charisma. However, you stated that you don't think that nobody really saw I can't say his name, I'm sorry, but
Yeah. Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping as a charismatic leader before he rose to power. What would you say were the defining traits that allowed him to rise to power despite this? And would you say that those traits contribute to the rising power of China?
That's interesting. Kissinger wrote, by the way, I got to refer to Kissinger wrote a great little book, which I read as an undergraduate, in which he looked at the bases for legitimacy of leadership. And charisma was one of them, charismatic leadership. Xi Jinping, in part, showed early on he had the bearing of it, and he's a big guy. The biggest Chinese leader since Mao or something. He's a big guy. And he had the bearing early on. He made the relationships. He didn't have charisma in terms of the TV personalities we think about. I would have to say, though, between the Donald and Hillary, we're not talking great charisma here. I don't see a lot of charisma there, but maybe I'm misreading it. But charisma is important, and she has the right kind for China, is my judgment. I've been watching, I've been looking over the border and/or going into the country since 1969. And I think he really has his finger on embodying that traditional notion of a strong leader. And Hu Jintao did not have it. Jiang Zemin, not really. Deng, in a funny way, I mean, he's a little tiny guy. But Deng Xiaoping did. He mainly blew smoke in people's faces. I mean, he was a tough little guy. But anyway, yeah, charisma is a very interesting question, but I would say it's one of Xi's strong points in the Chinese context. Questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Richard, my name is Xiaochi Ma, and I study in crop science, it's agriculture. So if I
You're
remember...
the second Ma I have met today.
Really? Wow.
So I have to ask, so do you have a Muslim background with the name
No.
Ma?
No.
Okay.
Oh yeah, some people have,
Right.
but I don't.
Okay.
Don't have.
Well, you're the second one who has not. I keep asking the question. I'll get somebody one of these days. Okay.
Okay, so
Which part of China are you from?
South Central China,
Where?
Hunan
Oh,
province.
okay.
Yeah.
I studied in Anhui Dashui at one point.
Okay.
It's kind of the center of the country, one of the poorest parts of the country. Oh, anyway, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So if I remember correctly, you defined Xi as an authoritarian nationalist.
Yeah.
So could you give me more detail on that? How do you define this word authoritarian?
Sure. He's
And,
not elected. He's he's an autocrat.
Okay, and is it positive or negative?
And it's just a factual statement. He was not elected.
Okay.
He's purged a lot of people who might pose a problem. I'm just being factual about it. 100,000 purged, 160 top leaders, including the 2 top PLA officers under Hu Jintao. So he's been very effective at consolidating power. So no question, he's authoritarian. These people didn't end up, they ended up in jail. They didn't end up just losing their jobs. So
So you mean he just has the power by himself?
He has consolidated a lot of power with the support. As you know, he has 5 additional members, friends of his, close associates, on the Standing Committee of the Politburo.
Okay.
I would suggest, for a great examination of what's going on, and China is such, Chinese politics is like any authoritarian one-party system, largely a black box. And how do you see inside it? Because it's not like they go on the street and say, and have debates, and everybody gets to watch, and television's in there, and they decide, yeah, let's purge this guy, let's send him out to here, and they don't do that. It's all secret. So the best look inside the black box I have seen lately is Chung Li's new book on Chinese politics and Xi Jinping. I recommend it to you. Often, when you look at communist countries, communist-led countries, you try to understand factions. Are they personal? Are they around policy? How many factions are there? Who are the factions? What loyalties are going on? All these machinations. We can determine that among the princeling elitist group that Xi Jinping heads, along with Jiang Zemin is his mentor. So it's kind of according to Chung Li, he calls it the Jiang-Xi faction versus Wen Jiabao Li Keqiang Li Keqiang faction. All right?
Yeah.
So, all right, so you got these 2 factions. One's more populist, one's, the kind of Li Keqiang faction is a little more populist. But in the end, there are these 2 factions. According to Chung, I watch these things, read all the studies. He's probably pretty right. And so she has been very effective at, while there's a balance between the 2 factions, he's really dominant. His faction is more dominant. And in order to maintain that dominance, we're all anticipating as we watch the development of the black box, we're seeing how much time she needs to ensure that his faction retains control. And does he, in fact, need to retain his control personally? Because he is more charismatic. He is effective. And he may be personally extremely ambitious. We know he's ambitious, but we just don't know. So I recommend that book. Anyway. Yes, sir.
Charles Carver, material engineering. But with the death of Lee Kuan Yew, do you think Singapore would still be able to maintain its unique mediator relationship between the United States and China, or People's Republic of China?
Singapore, God, Singapore is fascinating. How many been to Singapore? Anyway, I guess one person's been to Singapore. Yes, so Singapore is this brilliantly led city-state which has combined conservative, quasi-authoritarian political system with extreme economic, a very extremely open free market, which is quite a model that China has looked at. China looked at Japan, China looked at South Korea, China looked at Taiwan and Singapore, Deng Xiaoping and the gang, because these places were going wild economically, and they were looking for models. And Singapore was a big one. And Lee Kuan Yew personally said, look at how well we've done, you should be like us. And so Singapore is a fascinating place. It has played the balance of power game also brilliantly. It's far enough away from China. It has encouraged visits and even a U.S., kind of a part-time U.S. Navy base. It has great relations in China. It's kind of playing all sides as you'd have to in a city-state. It has a very strong military for its little tiny size. Kind of like Switzerland. Switzerland, people always say, oh, that's a neutral country. Yeah, it's a neutral country that's armed to the teeth. Every Swiss citizen has a rifle. And every man, anyway. Any man had a rifle, and I forget how many bullets. So Singapore has kind of taken the same approach. And we will see, depending on how the ebb and flow between the U.S. and China, the extent to which it continues to seek just a balance between the two. It seeks a balance. Like Vietnam seeks a balance. Like up until recently, the Philippines sought a balance. That's another story. Like Korea seeks a balance. Like Japan seeks a balance. Everybody wants a balance there. Most of them. Most of them. And Singapore, the ultimate example. Yeah. Any more? Okay. I apparently have to get to go to the airport too. One more. Quick one. Quick one. Anybody else? Somebody new?
Quick question.
Okay.
So you talk about the rise of the power will result in wars, and you talk about there is an exception. Do you think there is an exception for China?
We have to. It's a nuclear world. There's no option. But that means we have to be really smart. America can't do as we've been accused of, Churchill accused of, we can't do everything wrong first and then finally get it right. It's really difficult. But so much of it is going to rely on Chinese patience and I just pray that China stays stable so Chinese leaders can keep their heads cool. That's what worries me. An unstable China is a far more dangerous China in terms of its foreign policy.
Thank you.
Okay, there you go. Sure. This is an important distinction. Okay, well, I'm gonna start by referring to something that Steve Orland's mentioned, which was a dinner in Seattle 13 months ago when Xi Jinping landed on his way for meetings in Washington, D.C. and New York. And the one meeting he had where he engaged the public, it was totally private. This is not a public meeting, but there were 800 people there, was in Seattle. And I attended that. It was fascinating on a whole bunch of levels because I had an opportunity to sit for an hour and a half, 15 feet from this interesting leader, Xi Jinping. He sat, I'd say, rather regally. It was carefully scripted. He didn't say a word until he spoke at the podium. He sat at a long table. Imagine the head table was probably 80 feet long. And so there were dignitaries at it, and he was dead center. Next to him was his primary host. By the way, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations was one of the two host organizations. The other was the U.S.-China Business Council. The chairman of the U.S. Business Council then, that year, was Mark Fields, CEO, chairman of the Ford Motor Company, who sat right next to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping never acknowledged him, never spoke to him, never looked at him. There were jillions of cameras. The security personnel and the
Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award and was a nominee for the same award at California Polytechnic State University San Luis Obispo, where he taught in 1980 and 81. He specializes in the political economy of international relations and national security with emphasis on East Asia. Dr. Ellings earned his BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Washington. He studied in China as well, and some of that in the early 1980s when it was really, really interesting. And his professional activities continue to take him overseas regularly. And so we are really delighted that today, for this hour, he is here with us in Pullman, Washington, sharing his insights on Xi Jinping. China's president, reformer, emperor, or authoritarian nationalist is the question he will address. Please join me in giving Dr. Ellings a warm cougar welcome.
The nicest thing that's ever been said to me, you just said, Lydia, was that I was alive. You know, I'm a live speaker. That's great. I was kind of impressed at how live Super K, Henry Kissinger, is. He's 93, and I just pray I have as much hair as he does when I'm 93. That's an amazing amount of hair. Actually, it's something to comb in the morning. One other thing, Lydia, you mentioned, and this is something I'm always pointing out. You know, you go and you have to say when you were born or something. I always like to point out this is 19, not 18. You know?
Prior to serving with NBR, Dr. Ellings was assistant director and on the faculty of the Jackson School from 1986 to 1989. My research time shows through. In this capacity, he was a member of the school's executive committee and responsible for a wide range of administrative functions. He taught courses dealing with Asia, American foreign policy, and international relations, including foreign economic policy and international political economy, and was director of the George E. Taylor Foreign Affairs Institute. In 1984 and 85, Dr. Ellings served as legislative assistant in the United States Senate, Office of Senator Slade Gorton. He was the senator's senior advisor for and responsible for legislation on foreign and defense policy issues. Dr. Ellings publishes articles and chapters regularly, and he has a very, very long list of books that I'm not going to share right now. He's the co-founder and co-chairman of the editorial board of Asia Policy, 2006 to present, and founding editor of the NBR Analysis publication series. He established the Strategic Asia Program and Access Asia, the national clearinghouse that tracks specialists and their research on Asia, and has served as consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Department of State, and other U.S. government offices and agencies. He received the University of
To the present, he has stayed in contact, as he said, with Chinese leaders until then. In any case, out of respect for that long friendship, that close relationship between Chinese leaders and Kissinger, and age, Xi Jinping turned halfway around and turned his neck the other halfway around and listened to Kissinger speak. And Kissinger introduced him. The dinner ended with Xi Jinping speaking himself, carefully scripted. Winston Lord, a former U.S. ambassador to China, characterized the speech as basically full of newspeak. If you're a fan of George Orwell in 1984, you know what that means. But terms that really don't mean quite what they mean, and there was no content, but it didn't matter. It was diplomatic, and at the end, you had 800 people giving him a standing ovation. Well, okay, that's kind of sets the kind of tone for this. So I'm going to try to do two things really quickly. Why in the world do we care that much about Xi Jinping? Why should we know about him? Why should we care? And then secondly, once we do know something, some reason for knowing about him, what is it in particular? What is he like? And what is it we can learn about perhaps the future of China and U.S.-China relations and maybe world relations more broadly from knowing about him? So that's what I'm going to do really quickly, and I'm hoping to do so. Media from China overwhelmed everything else. The tables were populated, besides with media and security people, with business people. I'd say 50% of the room was filled with Chinese. And so, in any case, it went on. Xi Jinping sat there, and speaker after speaker went to the podium. Xi Jinping was officially welcomed by Commerce Secretary Pritzker, who spoke on behalf of President Obama, and said so. He never acknowledged her, never turned around. He had his back to the podium, right? Facing the audience, facing the cameras, brilliant spotlights on him. Gary Locke, the recent ambassador to China, spoke, and he didn't acknowledge him. Governor Inslee spoke. The mayor of Seattle spoke. Not once did Xi Jinping turn around until until Henry Kissinger strode to the podium. And here, of course, is at that time 92-year-old, at the behest of Nixon, opened up China. And Kissinger did acknowledge at one point, but it was really Nixon's idea that this breakthrough take place. In any case, Kissinger strode to the podium at 92 years of age. And because of his role in U.S.-China relations, from 69, when he took over as National Security Advisor, and particularly from 1971